Knowing that tea and coffee's waiting at the end, I'll get through this as fast as I can. But I have the good fortune to work on coastal environments, various parts of the world. So I get to go to nice places like that one that's just on the left-hand side of the screen. That's in the British Virgin Islands, where we've done some work over the years. That's what it looks like. And there, as in most coasts of the world, the biggest pressing issue is relating to climate change. Climate change and sea level rise, which, as I'll demonstrate to you shortly, don't pose a threat to coastal environments, but they pose a threat to human activities there. And that's a major point of departure from sort of mainstream thinking, that climate change and sea level rise pose a threat to the coast. They don't. They only pose a threat to our activities there. More than that, our response to that threat poses a bigger threat to the survival of coastal environments than do climate change or sea level rise. However, I've got several slides to illustrate that. So in a place like Anegada in the British Virgin Islands, what we would expect from sea level rise and climate change is coastal erosion, because coasts tend to move landwards, and we might expect more flooding to take place. If you have those things in a place like this, no one actually notices because no one lives there. The coast's free to adjust. That's the intrinsic strength of soft, dynamic coastlines. They can adjust in response to the changing environment. So they're enormously responsive. If you go to somewhere a bit closer to home, Kinnigo Bay and Donegal, we have surges and erosion there. Again, no one will really notice. That beach might move a little bit landwards, move a little bit higher, but otherwise the landscape will remain pretty much the same with rising sea level. And so it goes on. Undeveloped coasts worldwide, whether it's in South Africa, the Caribbean, Ireland, they can cope with changes that sea level rise and changing climate bring. However, once we start to develop the coastline, here's a sad looking picture of Dauphin Island in Georgia after a hurricane. And those are sort of multi-million-dollar houses. The remnants of what was a line of multi-million-dollar houses is reduced to these shacks that are sort of propped up on stilts after hurricanes gone past. And in a place like that, if we have surges and more erosion, well then clearly there is a problem. There's already a problem now, but that problem is going to get worse into the future. If you have a heavily developed coastline like this in the east coast of South Africa, again the rising sea level and storm surges is going to produce a lot of problems because we've got infrastructure right behind the beach. And if you are fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to live in a place like the Maldives, and we have surges and erosion, and you're living a very small number of centimetres above sea level, well, you're going to be in serious trouble if the coastline can't keep up. So the worst affected areas, or the places with the biggest risk, of course, are those where we have intensive development right next to the shoreline. There's a beach in Florida, lined with high-rise development. That beach is probably not a natural beach. It's actually certainly not a natural beach anymore. It will have been replenished many times. And as we'll see in a moment, that's one of the major ways we try and respond to these risks from surges and erosion. But that's not the answer that we hoped it would be. So here's an example of the dilemma that we create for ourselves in developing unsuitable parts of the coastline. This is the Mar Menor in southern Spain. It's enclosing, it's a large lagoon enclosed behind this long sandspit called La Manga. And that sandspit is very low. It's nowhere higher than about 2 meters above sea level. It's 50 kilometers long, so there's only one access road in and out. This coast has had tsunamis in the past. It has fairly frequent storms. So it's a high risk area with water on both sides of that sandspit. And yet it's lined with high-rise development. So if you go onto the ground on that site, there's an immediate erosion problem evident to you. And the erosion problem is not the beach, it's the houses that are on it. Because just like those other undeveloped shorelines, left to its own devices, that coast can evolve and change its shape in response to whatever nature happens to throw at it. If you think that's bad, if we swing through 90 degrees, see, missed that slide out, sorry. If we swing through 90 degrees, the beach is even narrower. And these little pillars that are sticking up are actually the manhole covers down to the sewage system. So they're sticking up about 2 metres above the beach level in the other side of that photograph. And the beach has more or less disappeared. So it's creating a problem where we have got to do something. We're either going to have to replace the beach, move the infrastructure, but it's one of these decision-making dilemmas with pros and cons all around. So to reiterate, climate change isn't a threat to beaches, but infrastructure and development are a threat to beaches. The beaches can take care of themselves. So when we put our infrastructure in the wrong place, in a place where it's vulnerable, that we create problems for ourselves. This is near Malile in County Down. You can see the steps that have been taken to protect those houses, which are built in a rather precarious place from coastal erosion. They've been built in a former dune. The dune's been eroded, so they've built these vertical walls to protect their property. So they're okay, but the beach in front is busy disappearing and getting lower as every tide comes past. Oh, sorry, that's the picture I was looking for. So you can see the dilemma here. The height of those pillars tells you how far the beach level is lowered since they were put in. And look how narrow that beach is compared to looking at 180 degrees away. So there's a serious problem here, but something is going to have to be done. So how do we do that? And the terminology for that now is climate change adaptation. We're adapting our activities to the threats posed by climate change. And most of the time, just like this, we don't have a clean slate. Usually there's some infrastructure or property or development in the way that constrains the choices that we have. But in a nutshell, there are 4 options. There's hard defences, soft defences, retreat, either actively or passively, or bizarrely, as it might seem, we can advance into the ocean. So we're going to take a brief look at each of those and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of those potential approaches. So here we are back to Malile. This is the default position. In Northern Ireland, we don't have a decision-making process that allows us to do anything but this. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible for government to say no when they're faced with an application to build a wall, because we don't have the legislation to do it. We don't have any strategic approach to the coast. So a lot of our coast is armoured. It's the same in the Republic. Here are houses ill-advisedly built on a sand dune during the Celtic Tiger boom. And to protect their investment, those people have covered the sand dune with rock armour, so stabilised that coast and constrained its ability to adjust to storms and climate change. There's the beach at Rossnowla in County Donegal. The first rock armour put in here was to protect the Sandhouse Hotel. That was closely followed by rock armour to protect the caravan park. Bearing in mind the caravans are on wheels and can be moved. And then every place there's a bungalow or other development, there's rock armour in front of it. So that's eventually going to spread along and the whole thing will be armoured. Here's a really bizarre example in Wales where they actually tarmac the beach. That held it in place, and the tarmac's black, so when you lie down in your towel, it's actually warmer than the sand would have been. It doesn't look very nice. But as a consequence, there's pressure everywhere where there's a perceived erosion problem to build a wall to stop the erosion. People just see the word erosion and suffix it with the word problem, not seeing erosion as simply a part of the coast's mode of adjustment to changing conditions. So here's a beautiful beach at Five Finger Strand. It's been eroding, the dune has been retreating for the last 20 years, and there's enormous public pressure to do something, but it's just dunes. You know, the dunes are supplying sand to the beach is adjusting to the changing circumstances, all related to that little tidal inlet. But nothing needs to be done, there's nothing at risk, and yet there's enormous public pressure to do something. People are demanding a wall be built to stop this erosion, for no obvious reason. And it's been very difficult for decision makers in Donegal to say no, but thankfully they have still stuck to their guns for a long time and been able to say no. And we're trapped in this kind of medieval view of Europe, you know, that if a clod is washed away, Europe is the less, as if a promontory was. It seems to be our prevailing view that erosion is a bad thing to be fought at every juncture. And we do the most bizarre things. Here's an enormous seawall in Fife. It's not going to go anywhere, but what's it protecting? A nice lawn. Here's Blackpool. Well, yes, the seawall here is protecting a fair amount of infrastructure behind, but the consequence of this wall is that the beach is being damaged. I'll explain that more in a moment. And no matter where you go, if you go to the Maldives, you find walls around tourist infrastructure. You find all sorts of horrendous looking bits of coast behind the tourist facade where people have interfered with the coast and damaged it, prevented it from functioning properly. You find disappeared beaches. Here's a seawall that has caused the beach to be squeezed out. There's barely enough room for the lifeguard to put a stool on it. And we use all sorts of infrastructure. There's wood being used in British Columbia where there's lots of trees. There are tetrapods in Japan, old cars in North Carolina. Hawaii, this is Waikiki Beach. Well, what's left of Waikiki Beach after the sea defences were put in? It's been utterly destroyed. And much of the world's coast has been turned into long, thin engineering projects, building defences along them. And back at home, it's the same thing. We have armoured coastlines all around the coast of Northern Ireland, using just about anything that comes to hand. And the final example, you'll be glad to hear, of rock armour doing its stuff is this little picture from the Gulf of Cadiz. There's rock armour at the bottom of that cliff, and the problem there is that cliff is what's supplying the sand to build the beach. So putting that rock armour in is temporarily cutting off the supply of sand to the beach, making it narrower and actually increasing the risk. And this is, in a nutshell, is what happens when you build a seawall or a hard defence. You can stabilise the coast, as this guy has done. He's defended his garden, but the beach has disappeared because the beach has been squeezed out. The guy next door has chosen not to defend his garden, so he's lost a bit of garden, but the beach has gone along with it, so he still has a beach at the bottom of his shorter garden. And this is the choice very often with hard defences. We can either choose to protect the property, or we can choose to protect the natural coastal environment. And 9 times out of 10, we choose to protect the property with negative effects on the coastal environment. So we cut out the resilience that's there in the natural beach and coastal system. And a long time ago, this was termed New Jerseyization because they were the longest involved in armouring their coastline, and they were producing coasts that looked like this, that used to formerly look like that, as a result of building, first of all, seawalls, then the beach started to disappear, then they built groins to try and trap what sand was left. Eventually it ends up looking more like a junkyard than a beach, and these houses that were built there to take advantage of the beach don't have any beach to take advantage of anymore. So the problems with seawalls or hard defences in general are when we actually build them, we're taking up part of the space on the beach. So they're reducing the area of the beach. When they're in, the waves are no longer able to dissipate their energy by erosion. They hit the wall and carry sand seawards. Also the beach, if it's moving landwards in any case, backs up against the wall and gets squeezed out. We sometimes call that coastal squeeze. And as we saw in the Gulf of Cadiz, the sediment supply gets cut off from any potential sources landwards of the sea defences. So there are lots of negative impacts of sea walls. Sadly, they're in many countries the only show in town. There's an old picture of the extent of engineered frontage around the European coast. And you can see that even though the continental colour is faded, you can still make out pretty well the outline of Europe. So there's a huge amount of engineered coastline around the European coast. Okay, so what are the other options? Well, the most widespread one is beach nourishment or beach replenishment. Sometimes those are known as soft defences because the sand that we use to replace sand that's been lost is potentially capable of adjusting the same way that a natural beach was. So this is beach nourishment taking place in Durban in South Africa, and it's very widespread around the world. Here is the Gold Coast in Australia, where these 2 jetties cut off the sand supply coming from New South Wales over there to Brisbane, up here Queensland on this side, and the coastline was eroding very rapidly. What they've done is put in these structures which suck the sand off the seabed on that side. It then gets pumped underneath the tidal inlet and re-pumped back out onto the beach on this side. So they've created a a means of getting sand from where it's needed, from where it's accumulating to the place where it's needed, and trying to overcome the problems created by the jetties. In a lot of places it's not as sophisticated as that. Here's a beach in Turkey which is covered with little mounds of sand that were trucked in before the holiday season. Those would be flattened out by a bulldozer. In the winter time the beach will probably be eroded, but next summer they'll come in with more sand, pile it up, bulldoze it flat, and there's a beach. The Durban one also involves pumping sand along the shoreline and then injecting it out onto the beach wherever it's needed. And again, it gets washed away in the winter time, gets replenished again the following summer. And this is very widespread in Europe and in the eastern United States. In France, 700,000 cubic metres per year. Italy, 1 million cubic metres per year. And the big daddy of all is Spain, with 10 million cubic metres of sand per year being pumped on their beaches. Almost any beach you've been on in Spain is a nourished beach. Very few natural beaches left. And this is the only way they can be maintained because of the ill-placed, ill-advisedly placed development around the Spanish coast. 10 million cubic metres is a lot of money. Sand costs about, I think, £100 per cubic metre, £100 a tonne, so there's a lot of money involved in that. That's before you even start moving it to put it onto the beach. So this is a very famous example, Miami Beach in Florida. This was it before its beach nourishment scheme was put in place. There it is afterwards. And you can see that it does a very good job. It's protected those buildings. It's created recreational space for people. And that one has actually lasted for quite a long time. But there are lots of problems with beach nourishment. They relate to the type of sand that we use. Finding sand is sometimes a problem. So we end up taking sand from offshore and pumping it onshore. Sometimes that sand has mud in it. Sometimes it has broken shells. I've been on nourished beaches where the shells are so sharp, you get your feet cut to ribbons if you're walking across it, because those shells have been minced up as they come through the dredger and then get pumped onto the beach. Sometimes it's got a lot of carbonate in it, so it sets like concrete. So you end up walking across something that's more like a car park than a beach. The issue of cost. Who pays to maintain that beach? The guys who are benefiting are the hotel owners and the property owners. So should that be paid for with public tax money, or should those guys be paying the cost of it? Because it's, after all, their property that's causing the problem and giving the need for nourishment in the first place. Another argument is that once you start doing that, you create more development. So there's positive feedback involved. Once you start building big wide beaches, more and more development takes place, and you actually increase the risk. It's also a meaningless design. People do try and calculate how long beaches are going to last for, but they don't. They never get it right. It's impossible to calculate how long they're going to last. Some of them disappear within months of being put in. Others last for years and years. And they cause environmental destruction, both where you take the sand from and where you place it. You know, if you were a little critter living on that beach and suddenly you get 10 million tons of sand dumped on top of you, you're toast. So there's an immediate effect of burying the critters that are there and also sucking the ones off the seabed that are in the sand that you're moving around. So as far as beach replenishment is concerned, yes, it widens the beach, yes, it protects the buildings while it's in place, but it's temporary, it's not solving the problem, and it's costly, and it carries all those additional environmental costs. There's a nice example of a beach scarp. This is a beach where the material is too cohesive, it's stuck together, so instead of forming a nice gentle beach after it's eroded, it formed this very deep, steep scarp. Just, you may remember during Hurricane Sandy, the governor of New Jersey fell down a scarp like that and broke his leg while he was out praising the work that was being done to try and patch up the coast. And he was actually the second US governor to fall down a beach erosion scarp like this. Okay, the third option is to retreat, and that of course is not a very popular option. It's a term that people don't like. No one likes to retreat or give up because it carries all sorts of negative connotations. So we can either retreat in disgrace like Napoleon here leaving Moscow, or we can retreat with some honour like the expeditionary force retreating from Dunkirk to go back again. But as far as the coast is concerned, retreat is a viable option in many places, but it's not one that's been widely taken up. But we can either retreat passively, which basically means we don't intervene, or we can retreat actively by intervening and moving things out of the way. So in terms of passive retreat, this is the Burley Gap in southeast England, owned by the National Trust, who have a policy of not interfering in coastal processes. This photograph was taken in 1985. The 2001 shoreline is back where that red arrow is. The present shoreline is about 2 houses further back than that. And what's happening here is those houses are collapsing into the sea as the cliff retreats. The cliff is supplying the gravel that's needed to build the beach, and the beach is moving landwards and upwards in response to the changing sea level and the changing climate conditions. But it's maintaining its overall integrity, and it's forming a very good natural buffer against future sea level rise and storms, at the cost of the loss of a few houses. So here's where we've been able to overcome this sort of human attachment to property and infrastructure. Here's another one where people have not overcome it quite so willingly. In Haysborough in Norfolk, a number of houses are threatened by erosion. There's a decision being made not to defend them, so their houses are slowly going over the edge and being abandoned, much to their chagrin, but they can't afford to pay for it, and the government decided it's not going to pay for it. And here's a nice example in North Carolina. This is a sort of multi-million-dollar beach house sitting on the Outer Banks. Started to get eroded, as a dune was removed, then the sea came in around it, and the last bit disappeared under the waves a couple of years later, and the whole house was gone. And that's very common in the eastern United States, where shorelines are migrating quickly. Here are roads going to nowhere. They're temporarily protected by sandbags, but you know, those houses are living in a dream world if they think they're going to survive, because they will eventually be removed by the waves. There are some teetering on the very edge. North Carolina has a complete ban on hard defences, so those sandbags are a temporary measure. They're only allowed to be temporarily put in. So, but as a consequence, property is being lost, but the beach is surviving and it's moving landwards. Here's another example. You can see what these guys used to be in the position that the row behind was in. Now they're stranded out on the beach and in the surf zone. Those are passive retreat. We just don't interfere and we let things take their course. But we can move things. People sometimes say, you know, what if we've got valuable cultural sites, valuable property that's archaeologically important? What about those? We can't let them fall in the sea. Well, it's possible to move important buildings. Here's, if you're in the US or Australia, where people build their houses on detached from their foundations, it's easy to lift them off and move them. But it can be done here. There's a house being moved in the way of the Channel Tunnel construction. And it's nothing new, actually. This is a hotel owned by the railways in New Jersey in the late 1800s. It was lifted off its foundations. Being a railway company, they brought in lots of tracks and engines, and they just pulled the whole thing back. So it can be done, and it is done in a few places. This is known as the Outlaw House in North Carolina. It's been moved 5 times. Now you might say, why not just move it in one go? But the people who own it like to be close to the sea, so they stay there until they can't stay any longer, and then they move it back a little bit at a time. And there's a very famous one, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. It's the tallest brick structure in North America. And it was lifted off its foundations, moved by train about a mile back from its present position in order to preserve it from coastal recession. So it's possible for us to retreat in anticipation of changes or in response to changes by simply doing nothing. And that has been around for a while. This is a 2008 newspaper article talking about the option of retreat in Norfolk that would flood a large area of land, create a lot of loss of property, but it would sustain the coastal environments, which after all were actually reclaimed in the first place back in the Middle Ages. And then perhaps the best example of retreat comes from the Maldives, where several years ago the previous president started buying up land in Australia and India in anticipation of the country becoming uninhabitable. And their view was that we might have to leave the country entirely because we won't be able to keep up and survive with rising sea level. So I think that's kind of the most dramatic example potentially of retreating in the face of sea level. You not only abandon your infrastructure, but you take your people and you up and leave and go somewhere else. So those in a nutshell are the options that we have for dealing with climate change at the coast. I haven't got time, and I don't want to delay the tea any longer to talk about advance, but there are some slides in there that you might want to look at. The example I'll give is Dubai, where we're advancing into the sea in the face of rising sea level. However, those are the examples, and hopefully there's something that might be of some use in there. Thanks.